Jerry Lee Lewis thought he was better than Chuck Berry. What happened next was dangerous. This is the story of how the Killer brought genuine violence to rock and roll, and how Chuck Berry proved that true mastery lies not in destruction, but in the wisdom to know when someone has crossed a line that should never be crossed. It was August 15, 1958, at the Brooklyn Paramount Theater in New York. Both Jerry Lee Lewis and Chuck Berry were headlining a rock and roll package tour that was supposed to showcase the biggest names in the genre. Jerry Lee was at the height of his fame, riding the success of Whole Lotta Shakin' Goin' On and Great Balls of Fire, and his ego had grown as large as his reputation for dangerous, unpredictable behavior. Jerry Lee Lewis had earned his nickname The Killer, not just from his explosive piano playing, but from a personality that genuinely frightened people in the music industry. Unlike Little Richard, whose wildness was theatrical and ultimately harmless, Jerry Lee's intensity carried an undertone of real menace that made promoters nervous and other musicians keep their distance. Chuck Berry, now 32 years old, had established himself as rock and roll's premier guitarist and most sophisticated songwriter. He had learned to handle challenges from other musicians with a combination of musical superiority and diplomatic grace, but he had never encountered anyone quite like Jerry Lee Lewis. The trouble began during the afternoon rehearsal when Jerry Lee Lewis arrived at the theater in a mood that everyone immediately recognized as dangerous. He had been drinking, which always made his volatile personality even more unpredictable, and he was carrying a bottle of lighter fluid and a book of matches, props he used for his signature move of setting his piano on fire during performances. "Where's Chuck Berry?" Jerry Lee demanded as he strutted into the theater, his blonde hair perfectly styled, but his eyes showing the kind of wild intensity that made smart people step back. Chuck Berry was on stage running through a sound check, his Gibson guitar producing the clean, precise notes that had become his trademark. He looked up from his instrument to see Jerry Lee Lewis walking toward the stage with what could only be described as hostile intent. "Chuck Berry," Jerry Lee's voice echoed through the empty theater, carrying a tone that was part challenge, part threat. "I hear you think you're the king of rock and roll around here." Chuck Berry set down his guitar and walked to the edge of the stage. He had dealt with jealous musicians before, but there was something in Jerry Lee Lewis's demeanor that told him this was different. This wasn't going to be a friendly competition or a battle of egos. This was something darker. "Jerry Lee," Chuck said calmly, his voice carrying the authority that came from years of commanding stages and dealing with difficult situations. "What can I do for you?" Jerry Lee Lewis climbed up onto the stage without being invited, violating the basic etiquette that governed interactions between professional musicians. His movements were aggressive and theatrical, designed to intimidate rather than impress. "What you can do for me," Jerry Lee said, pointing a finger directly at Chuck's chest, "is admit that I'm a better musician than you are. I'm tired of hearing about Chuck Berry this and Chuck Berry that. I can do everything you can do, but I do it with more fire, more passion, more danger." Chuck Berry noticed that several other musicians and crew members had stopped what they were doing to watch the confrontation. Everyone could sense that this was not a typical backstage disagreement. There was genuine menace in Jerry Lee Lewis's voice and posture. "Jerry Lee, you're a talented piano player," Chuck replied, maintaining his calm demeanor despite the obvious threat. "There's room in rock and roll for both of us." Jerry Lee Lewis laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Room for both of us? Chuck, you don't understand. I don't want room, I want your spot. I want people to forget Chuck Berry ever existed and remember only the Killer." The confrontation escalated quickly from there. Jerry Lee Lewis walked over to the piano that had been set up for the show and began playing Great Balls of Fire with a violence that was both impressive and disturbing. But this wasn't just a performance, it was a threat. As he played, Jerry Lee pulled out his bottle of lighter fluid and began squirting it onto the piano keys while he continued playing. "This is how you really play rock and roll," Jerry Lee shouted over the music, his fingers still flying across the keys, even as the lighter fluid made them slippery and dangerous. "This is what real passion looks like." Chuck Berry watched with growing concern as Jerry Lee Lewis pulled out his matches. The smell of lighter fluid was strong in the theater, and everyone present realized they were watching someone who had crossed the line from showmanship into genuine recklessness. "Jerry Lee, that's enough," Chuck said firmly, his voice carrying a new edge of authority. "You're going to hurt someone." "The only person who's going to get hurt," Jerry Lee snarled, striking a match and holding it near the piano, "is anyone who thinks they're better than the killer." What happened next shocked everyone in the theater. Jerry Lee Lewis actually lit the piano on fire while he was still playing it, his fingers dancing across burning keys as flames began to spread across the instrument. The theater filled with smoke and the acrid smell of burning wood and piano strings. Chuck Berry had seen enough. In one swift motion, he grabbed a fire extinguisher from the side of the stage and walked directly toward the burning piano, completely unafraid of Jerry Lee Lewis's growing hysteria. "Move away from the piano, Jerry Lee," Chuck commanded, his voice carrying the kind of authority that brooks no argument. Jerry Lee Lewis, caught up in his own dangerous performance, initially refused to stop playing. But when Chuck Berry aimed the fire extinguisher directly at the burning piano, Jerry Lee finally stepped back, his face flushed with excitement and alcohol. Chuck Berry calmly extinguished the flames, then turned to face Jerry Lee Lewis with an expression that made everyone in the theater understand why Chuck had survived and thrived in the music industry for so many years. "Jerry Lee," Chuck said, his voice quiet, but carrying to every corner of the theater, "that was the most unprofessional, dangerous, and stupid thing I've ever seen a musician do. You could have burned down this entire theater and killed people." Jerry Lee Lewis, his adrenaline still pumping from his destructive performance, seemed to mistake Chuck's calm response for weakness. "Are you scared, Chuck? Are you finally seeing what real rock and roll looks like?" Chuck Berry's response was swift and devastating. He picked up his guitar, plugged it into the nearest amplifier, and began playing a version of Johnny B. Good that was so technically perfect, so emotionally powerful, and so musically sophisticated that it made Jerry Lee Lewis's Fire and Destruction show look like the amateur hour it really was. But Chuck Berry wasn't just demonstrating his musical superiority. He was teaching a lesson about what real strength looked like. His guitar work was controlled, precise, and absolutely commanding, but it contained no violence, no destruction, no threat to anyone's safety. It was pure artistry channeled through complete technical mastery. The contrast was overwhelming. Jerry Lee Lewis had brought fire, destruction, and genuine danger to the stage. Chuck Berry brought music. Real music that touched the soul without threatening anyone's safety. When Chuck Berry finished playing, the theater was completely silent. Jerry Lee Lewis stood among the smoking remains of the piano he had destroyed, suddenly looking foolish rather than dangerous. "That," Chuck Berry said, unplugging his guitar and speaking directly to Jerry Lee Lewis, "is what real rock and roll sounds like. It doesn't need fire or destruction or threats. It just needs music." Jerry Lee Lewis, faced with the obvious superiority of Chuck Berry's performance and the quiet strength of his character, seemed to deflate. The alcohol was wearing off, and he was beginning to realize how badly he had miscalculated the situation. Jerry Lee started, but Chuck Berry held up a hand to stop him. "Jerry Lee, you're talented, but you're dangerous. Not dangerous in a cool way. Dangerous in a way that hurts people and destroys things that don't belong to you. Until you learn the difference between passion and violence, you're going to have problems in this business." The aftermath of that confrontation became one of the most talked about incidents in rock and roll history. Word spread quickly through the music industry that Jerry Lee Lewis had challenged Chuck Berry and been completely outclassed, not just musically but morally. Jerry Lee Lewis, to his credit, seemed to understand that he had crossed a line that should never be crossed. In interviews over the following weeks, he stopped making direct challenges to other musicians and focused more on his own performances rather than trying to destroy his competition. Chuck Berry's handling of the situation earned him even more respect from his peers and the music industry in general. He had faced down a genuinely dangerous challenger without resorting to violence or destruction himself, proving that true strength came from self-control and artistic mastery rather than the ability to intimidate others. The burned piano became something of a legend in rock circles. The theater owner had to pay for repairs and new equipment, but the story of Jerry Lee Lewis's destructive challenge and Chuck Berry's controlled response became one of rock and roll's most important moral lessons. Music critics wrote extensively about the incident, with most concluding that it demonstrated the difference between genuine artistry and mere showmanship taken to dangerous extremes. Jerry Lee Lewis was undeniably talented, but his willingness to put people at risk for the sake of a dramatic effect showed a fundamental misunderstanding of what music was supposed to accomplish. Chuck Berry, meanwhile, had demonstrated something far more impressive than the ability to set things on fire. He had shown the wisdom to know when someone had gone too far, the courage to stand up to genuinely dangerous behavior, and the class to handle the situation without escalating the violence. The incident also highlighted the different approaches that rock and roll musicians could take to commanding attention. Jerry Lee Lewis believed that shock value and danger were the keys to memorable performance. Chuck Berry proved that technical mastery and emotional authenticity were far more powerful than any pyrotechnic display. Years later, when Jerry Lee Lewis was asked about the confrontation, he would acknowledge that he had learned an important lesson that day. Chuck Berry showed me the difference between being dangerous and being stupid, Jerry Lee said in a 1975 interview. I thought setting things on fire made me a better musician. Chuck showed me that music doesn't need destruction to be powerful. Chuck Berry, when asked about the incident in later interviews, always spoke with understanding rather than anger about Jerry Lee Lewis's behavior. Jerry Lee was young and confused about what made music important, Chuck said. He confused violence with passion and destruction with creativity. But he was talented, and talent can learn from mistakes if it's willing to listen. The confrontation between Chuck Berry and Jerry Lee Lewis became a template for how professional musicians should handle dangerous or unprofessional behavior from their peers. Chuck's response, calm, firm, and focused on the music rather than the personality conflict, became a model that many other artists would follow in similar situations. The incident also demonstrated that rock and roll, for all its rebellious energy, still needed boundaries and professional standards. Jerry Lee Lewis had crossed those boundaries, and Chuck Berry had enforced them without becoming a bully or a tyrant himself. Most importantly, the confrontation proved that true musical mastery was about creation rather than destruction. Jerry Lee Lewis could burn a piano, but Chuck Berry could make a guitar sing. Jerry Lee could create spectacle, but Chuck could create art that lasted long after the smoke had cleared. The day Jerry Lee Lewis thought he was better than Chuck Berry became the day rock and roll learned an important lesson about the difference between dangerous showmanship and genuine artistic power. Chuck Berry didn't need fire to burn tea. His music generated its own heat, its own energy, its own unforgettable impact. In the end, Jerry Lee Lewis's challenge taught everyone present something valuable about what real strength looked like. It wasn't the ability to destroy or intimidate, it was the wisdom to know when to be gentle and when to be firm, when to compete, and when to simply demonstrate superiority through excellence rather than aggression. The dangerous confrontation between the killer and the master showed that in music, as in life, the most powerful response to destructive behavior is often the creation of something beautiful, something lasting, something that proves violence is never necessary when you have true skill and genuine class. If this incredible story of danger, wisdom, and the triumph of artistry over destruction moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with anyone who needs to learn the difference between being dangerous and being powerful. Have you ever seen someone confuse aggression with strength? Let us know in the comments, and and don't forget to ring that notification bell for more amazing stories about the confrontations that taught rock and roll its most important lessons.